Have you ever sat in your favorite chair, the one near the window where the light falls just right in the afternoon, and asked yourself, when did people stop listening to me? Not in an angry way, not even bitter, just a quiet, aching curiosity. You try to recall the last time someone asked, how you were really asked, and waited for the full answer. You think about your children, your grandchildren maybe, how the conversations have become shorter, how the check-ins feel more like obligations, how the warmth in their eyes has cooled. Just enough for you to feel it, but not enough to name it without sounding overly sensitive. I want you to know something. From the very beginning of this conversation, you are not alone in that feeling. And even more importantly, you are not the cause of it. But you might be holding on to habits that unknowingly feed it. Let me tell you a story. There's a woman I know, let's call her Margaret. She turned 68 last spring. She's a strong woman, raised 3 children, mostly on her own, after her husband passed early. She gave them everything, her energy, her youth, her career, her dreams, and she never complained. She was always there, even when they didn't ask her to be. But lately, Margaret has started to feel invisible. Her phone rings less. Her ideas at family gatherings are dismissed with a polite nod. She offered to help her daughter with the baby a few months back, and her daughter said, "Thanks, Mom, but I've got it. You don't need to worry." And it wasn't unkind, but it felt like a door quietly shutting. The thing is, Margaret didn't change, but people's perception of her did. Why? Because she kept doing something most of us do when we love deeply. She kept overgiving, even when no one asked. She kept offering advice that wasn't needed, help that wasn't wanted, presence that wasn't appreciated. She did it because that's how she expressed love, and for decades, it worked. But now, it reads differently, not as kindness, but as interference, as desperation, as neediness. And I know that word can sting, neediness. But let's call it what it is, not to shame ourselves, but to gently understand it. Because when you give and give, when you show up again and again, despite being dismissed, when you offer parts of yourself in hopes of being seen, you are not just giving love. You are asking for value, and often, you're giving too much of yourself away in the process. The first thing that slowly chips away at respect is not knowing when to stop giving. There is beauty in generosity. But after 60, your value isn't in what you can do for others. It's in who you are. And if you keep acting like your worth depends on being useful, people will treat you like a tool, and tools, as we both know, get put back in the drawer when they're no longer needed. Now, that doesn't mean you stop caring, but it does mean you stop over-functioning. You stop rushing in to rescue. You stop offering yourself as a permanent solution to problems that aren't yours to solve. You let people experience their own lives. You allow space for them to come to you, not because they need something, but because they miss you. The second thing we do that invites quiet disrespect is this. We apologize for existing. You might not even realize you're doing it. It's in the way you say, "Sorry, I don't mean to bother you," before speaking, or "I know you're busy." But every time you call, it's in the way you move through your own home when the kids visit. Like a guest. Like you're afraid to take up space. Like your presence needs to be justified. Helen, a dear friend of mine, once told me about the moment she realized she was doing this. Her son came over with his new girlfriend. Helen had spent the day cleaning, cooking, putting together a lovely evening. But the moment they walked in, she began shrinking. She hovered instead of sitting. She laughed too loudly. She kept saying, "Let me know if I'm in the way." And then this is what broke her. She actually asked, "Is it okay if I eat now? Or do you want to go first?" She wasn't in the way. She was the heart of that home. But somewhere along the line, she'd convinced herself that her presence was a favor other people tolerated. So I want to ask you gently, when did you begin asking for permission to exist? It's not your job to be small. You do not need to apologize for taking up space in your own story. When you stop showing up as a question mark and start living like a period clear, firm, whole people respond, because confidence doesn't shout, it whispers, "I belong here," and that's enough. And maybe the third quiet mistake we make is the hardest one to see. We make ourselves too available. I know how that sounds. Isn't being available a good thing? Isn't it what good parents and grandparents do? But let me ask you this. When you answer every call, every favor, every last-minute need without hesitation, what message are you sending? You're telling the world that your time is always for sale, that your plans don't matter, that your own priorities are optional. Frank was a retired teacher I met at a local community center. He had a heart as wide as the ocean, always offering rides, fixing things, dropping off soup, and yet, he felt more alone than ever. "I'm always there when they need me," he said one day, eyes full of a quiet sadness. "But no one ever just visits. No one just wants me. Because when you're always on call, you stop being a person. You become a service." And Frank made a brave change. He stopped being so available. He started scheduling time for himself. He took up painting, began going for walks without telling anyone where he was. He created boundaries, not walls, but fences with gates he controlled. And slowly, something changed. His daughter began asking, "Are you free to talk this weekend?" Instead of assuming, his grandson started texting just to share a joke. They noticed his absence. They remembered his presence. You see, respect isn't demanded, it's cultivated, and it grows in the quiet soil of self-worth. There's something quiet and powerful about the moment you decide you've had enough, not out of anger, but out of clarity. You stop trying to earn the very thing that should have been freely given all along, respect, and instead of chasing after it, you start becoming the kind of person who naturally commands it. That shift is subtle, but it's where everything begins to change. Margaret, the woman I told you about earlier, once believed that if she kept giving, kept showing up, kept being useful, eventually her children would recognize her efforts. But she came to understand something deeper. It wasn't about what she did or didn't do. It was about how she saw herself, and how that self-perception quietly taught others how to treat her. That's where many of us find ourselves after 60, not in a crisis, but at a quiet crossroads. We realize we've lived decades learning how to keep the peace, how to be agreeable, how to avoid upsetting anyone, and somehow, in all that effort to be liked, we lost the solid core of being respected. It often starts with people-pleasing. Oh, how familiar that pattern becomes. Smiling when something hurts, nodding when we disagree, saying yes when everything in our chest is whispering no. It's not weakness, it's survival. Something we learned in families, in marriages, in work environments. We learned that saying what others wanted to hear made life smoother, less conflict, fewer waves. But over time, those little silences, those self-betrayals, they build up, and they teach others that our comfort is optional, that our time can be rescheduled, that our opinions can be disregarded without consequence. And before long, we're sitting in rooms full of people we love, wondering why no one listens. Take Ethan, for example. He's 72. He spent his whole life trying to be the nice guy. Never said no to a neighbor. Always picked up the phone when his kids called, even if they only called when they needed something. He didn't mind, he said. It's good to be needed. But one day, after missing a doctor's appointment, because he stayed on the phone too long trying to help his daughter plan her vacation, something hit him. He realized no one had asked how he was feeling. No one even knew he had the appointment. And worse, he had let it happen. Not because they didn't care, but because he never gave them a reason to ask. He always put himself last, so he started doing something brave. He began to pause before saying yes. He started replying, "Let me think about it," instead of immediately agreeing. He began protecting his time not out of bitterness, but from a place of newfound self-respect. And over time, people noticed. They didn't walk away. In fact, they leaned in more, because when you respect your own time, others start doing the same. Now let's talk about over-sacrificing. That sneaky, quiet pattern that feels noble, but leaves us hollow. You see, many of us grew up believing that sacrifice was the highest form of love, and maybe that was true in some seasons. When the children were small, when we were building homes from nothing, when survival required putting others first. But now, in this chapter of life, constant self-sacrifice becomes a recipe for resentment. Grace, a retired nurse and mother of 5, told me something that stayed with me for years. She said, "I spent my whole life pouring from a cup that never refilled, and I thought that made me strong. But all it did was teach my children that I don't need care. And now that I do, they don't see it. That's the cruel twist of over-sacrificing. The more you do without, the more invisible your needs become. And the longer you wear the mask of strength, the harder it is for others to believe you ever needed help to begin with. But Grace made a change too. She started asking for help gently. Directly, she admitted when she was tired. She said, "I can't make dinner tonight, but I'd love to see you tomorrow if you bring something over." And something beautiful happened. Her children grown, busy, overwhelmed began to soften. They stopped taking her for granted. They started seeing her as a person again, not a function, because love flows both ways. And when you let others show up for you, it reminds them of their own goodness too. Then there's the issue of conflict, or rather, our fear of it. How many times have you swallowed your truth just to keep things calm? How often have you bitten your tongue during a visit, just to avoid being called difficult, or emotional, or too sensitive? Jack, a father of 3, used to smile through conversations that felt like little paper cuts. His children would make jokes at his expense, dismiss his thoughts, change the subject when he spoke too long. And he'd smile, always smile, until one day, he didn't. They were having lunch, and his son said, "Dad, no offense, but you wouldn't understand. Things are different now." Jack set down his fork, looked at his son, calm as still water, and said, "Just because I'm older doesn't mean I've stopped learning. And it doesn't mean I have nothing to offer. I may not know your world, but I do know mine. And I hope you'll let me share it. No shouting, no guilt, just truth, spoken with grace." That moment didn't just change the tone of that lunch. It changed the way his son saw him. Not as someone to humor, but as someone to honor. You see, boundaries are not about building walls. They're about drawing lines that remind people where we begin and where we deserve space. And setting them doesn't push people away. It invites them closer, into a relationship that feels mutual, balanced, real. When we stop trying to be palatable, agreeable, endlessly available, and instead show up as our whole, honest selves, that's when respect begins to root itself again. Not through force, but through truth. And sometimes, truth whispers. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't need to win. It simply needs to be lived. When you start showing up differently, not louder, not harsher, but more rooted in yourself, something interesting begins to happen. People notice, even if they don't mention it at first. The tone of the room shifts. Conversations stretch longer. Eye contact lingers. They might not say it aloud, but they feel it. Something in you has changed. And that change isn't rebellion. It's restoration. I remember Chloe, a woman in her early 70s. Soft-spoken, gentle. Someone who always wore lavender sweaters and baked banana bread for her neighbors. For years, she tried to keep the family together, organizing gatherings, remembering birthdays, making the long drives. But she always returned home with this ache in her chest. Her kids were polite, yes, but distracted. The grandkids rarely looked up from their phones. Her stories were brushed aside. Her efforts went unrecognized. And still, she smiled. She told herself, at least they showed up. But one winter evening, after a particularly lonely Christmas dinner, where she cooked for hours and everyone left before dessert, something in her shifted. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet realization. She deserved more than being tolerated. So she stopped hosting. She didn't announce it. She simply didn't organize the next event. And when they asked, she smiled kindly and said, "I thought maybe it was time someone else took the lead." Then she signed up for a pottery class. She started attending a book club at the library. She met new people. She laughed more. And the next time her daughter visited, she noticed something odd. "You look different, Mom," she said. And Chloe, without planning it, replied, "I feel more like myself lately." That's the shift. When you stop bending over backward for people who don't even notice the effort. When you reclaim your time without apology. When you let go of the need to be useful and start allowing yourself to simply be, it radiates. You walk taller. You speak slower. You move with intention, not desperation. And people sense it. They can't always name it, but it draws them in. Because dignity is magnetic. And this change doesn't mean you become cold or distant. It means you learn to love from a place of fullness instead of emptiness. You begin to love yourself enough to stop performing for scraps of attention. You start investing in things that bring you joy, even if no one else claps. That's what happened with Caleb. He was always the fixer in the family. Car broke down, call Dad. Need help moving, call Dad. Babysitter canceled, call Grandpa. And he did it all, until one day he realized no one ever called, just to say, "How are you?" He didn't get angry. He got honest with himself first, and then with them. The next time his daughter asked him to drive 2 hours to help with her backyard, he paused, and for the first time in years, he said, "I'd love to help, but I've already made plans that day. Maybe next weekend." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, okay, sure, I'll check my schedule." It wasn't a big moment, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. Because Caleb wasn't just saying no, he was saying, "I matter too." And from that moment, things began to shift. His daughter started checking in more often, not just when she needed something. His grandkids asked about his model trains. He wasn't chasing respect anymore. He was living it. That's the truth we don't hear enough. When you stop asking for validation and start embodying value, people feel it. You don't need to explain your worth. You need to remember it. Breathe it in, live from it. And as you do, you may notice something surprising. Joy starts to return. Not the loud, flashy kind, the quiet kind. The kind that sits with you in the morning light, that moves through your hands while you garden, that rises when you say no without guilt and yes without fear. You begin to laugh without needing a reason. You start to look at your reflection and see a friend, not a stranger. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head to prove a point that doesn't need proving. You become rooted in the here and now, not in who you were to others, but in who you've always been. Sophie once said to me, "I thought I had to stay relevant to stay loved, but I've learned that my presence is enough." She wasn't baking as much anymore. Her hands were tired, but she started painting again, something she hadn't done since college. Her daughter saw her canvases one day and said, "I didn't know you could paint like this, Mom." And Sophie smiled and replied, "There's still a lot you don't know about me." That's what happens when you reclaim yourself. People begin to rediscover you, not as a parent, a helper, a background presence, but as a whole person, someone with passions, boundaries, joys, depth. And your relationships deepen too, not because you fixed them, but because you stopped trying to force them. You started showing up differently, and people responded. That's the most powerful lesson of all. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You only need to stand firmly in your light. And when you do, those around you begin to soften. Not always immediately, not always in ways you expect, but little by little, they begin to listen more closely, to ask more thoughtfully, to speak with more care, not because you demanded it, but because your quiet strength reminded them of who you are. You are not a burden. You are not invisible. You are not past your time. You are here, still becoming, still radiant. If you're still here with me, still listening, still reflecting, then I want to say something simple but deeply sincere. Thank you. Thank you for honoring your time. Thank you for walking through this conversation with open eyes and an open heart. Thank you for being brave enough to look inward, to consider changes not out of guilt, but out of love. Love for yourself. Love for the life that is still blooming in you. Even now, I know this hasn't been an easy conversation. These things, people-pleasing, over-sacrificing, fear of conflict, the slow fading of our presence in the lives of those we cherish, they are not small things. They are deep. They are tied to memory, to love, to years and years of trying to do the right thing. But here you are, still growing, still learning, still showing up for yourself in ways that maybe, for decades, you never thought you needed to, and that is beautiful. If you've ever sat quietly after a phone call ended too quickly, or after a family visit that felt more like a chore than a joy, if you've ever swallowed your truth to avoid being called dramatic, or caught yourself over-explaining just to feel heard, then please know, you are not alone. You are not the only one searching for dignity in a world that moves too fast to notice the stillness of your wisdom. But today, something's different. Because today, you gave yourself the permission to ask. What if I stopped doing the things that made me smaller? What if I lived these later years not in the shadow of who I used to be to others, but in the fullness of who I still am to myself? That shift may seem subtle, but it's a revolution. The soft kind, the gentle kind, the kind that doesn't shout, that doesn't demand, that simply walks forward, day by day, embodying presence, worth, and quiet joy. I'd love to hear your voice now, truly. If anything we've talked about today resonated with you, even just a little, I invite you to share your story in the comments below. Not for attention, not for validation, but because your story might be the very thing someone else needs to hear to feel a little less alone. Has your relationship with your adult children changed over time? What helped you cope or grow through it? What was the moment that made you step back and see things differently? We're walking this road together, and while our paths may not be identical, the longing underneath them often is to be seen, to be respected, to feel like we matter not just for what we've done, but for who we are. So, if this message touched something in you, I'd love for us to stay connected. Click subscribe, not because it's expected, but because this space, we're building it together. A space for truth, for reflection, for strength that doesn't need to roar. You deserve peace. You deserve rest. You deserve to feel the sun on your face and know that you don't have to earn love anymore. It's yours. It always has been. And if today's conversation helped you remember that, even for a moment, then it's been worth every word. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself. You are deeply valued. You are never too late, and you are not alone.